next panel, this is, I want to forward, do you have more? Yeah, so this is an election year, kind of unlike any other election year. I think no matter what side of the fence you're on, you can agree with me on that one. So we thought we would talk about immigration reform from the standpoint of the two candidates, because it's really, immigration's a hot button topic. It's on the news all the time. And the differences between the two candidates this time is stark. So we thought it would be worth mentioning what our thoughts are on what the landscape will be if Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton are elected. And then after that, we're going to have some questions for the panel on some related issues. So first of all, I don't really have any slides other than these cartoons. I don't know if you can see the cartoons very well. Hillary and Donald Trump are in the race. I think actually, according to the latest polls, Trump might be a little closer than it looks in this particular slide. And then, can you guys see this? It says, this is the immigration overhaul, and it says, the donkey says, so far, this is making everybody mad. We must be on the right track. And the elephant says, I don't know, I'm still on the fence. It was hard to find a cartoon that wasn't really, there wasn't really anti-Trump or anti-Hillary, believe me. It took me quite a while. So let me just tell you very briefly on border security. Trump has repeatedly said he'll build a wall across the entire Mexican border, make the Mexicans pay for it, and I checked, that's roughly 2,000 miles. And also that he plans to triple the number of ICE officers, those are the enforcement officers, and increase the Custom and Borders officers by 5,000. Clinton is a supporter of something called the Secure Fence Act, which does include 700 miles of that 2,000 of barricades. However, at this point, she said that border security is actually not a really top priority because, you know, I don't know how many of you know this, but we right now have sort of a net zero immigration coming across the Mexican border, meaning just as many people are leaving as are coming for various reasons. You know, maybe it's due in part to deportations, maybe it's due in part to people just deciding that they've had enough and are getting squeezed out and going back or whatever. But it's a fact that there really is and has been for some time sort of a net zero immigration coming across the border. So you can probably tell where my bias is, so I'm just gonna I'm not going to pretend I'm going to, you know, just present even points of view on this because I'm an immigration lawyer. So after all, I am a pro-immigration person. On enforcement, Donald Trump has called for the immediate removal of all undocumented immigrants. But recently, he sort of softened this stance to focus more on people who've committed crimes, which is actually really also what is currently the policy. The difference is that he's asking for automatic deportations of certain individuals, including, for example, gang members. I don't know if that means without hearings or what that actually means, that we just completely let go of due process in the United States or what. He wants to punish countries that refuse to take people back. So I don't know if you know this, but some countries won't, you know, participate in issuing documents or whatever to take people back. And so he has the idea that we should have sanctions or whatever against those countries. Clinton says her priority is to avoid deportation that breaks up families and focus on deporting those who pose a threat to our national security. So on immigration reform, Trump has stated repeatedly that he'll show no sympathy to the undocumented, and also that he wants to end birthright citizenship, which is citizenship granted to someone who's born in the United States. Clinton has promised to have a pathway to citizenship within her first 100 days, and also to continue to support the DACA and DAPA policies that we're going to talk about in a little more detail in a second. Trump has promised to undo them immediately. And then finally, on legal immigration, which is probably something that, the reason most of us are here today, Trump has said that foreign workers take jobs away from Americans and keep down salaries. So therefore, he's called for revamping the H-1B program such that unemployed Americans are offered jobs first, however that would happen. He's also called for completely abolishing the J-1 exchange visitor program. And I think we'll be talking a little bit about what that program is in a minute for those of you who don't know. Clinton advocates for a comprehensive immigration reform and wants to get rid of the 3- and 10-year bars. And what that is people who have overstayed a certain period in the United States who can maybe become legal through family or through employment have to leave the U.S. in order to re-enter through their through the consulate, and the fact that they've overstayed bars them from coming back for this 3- or 10-year period. 10 years if they've overstayed for more than 1 year or violated their status significantly for over 1 year. So that is something. I'm old enough as an immigration lawyer to remember when we didn't have that, and it was actually quite easy to work with people and figure out a path to permanent residence and citizenship back in the old days. It's no longer the case because of that 3- and 10-year bar. So when people say people need to get in line, that's all they have to do is get in line, there really is no line unless they're looking at coming in, 10 or more years down the road. Okay, that's all I wanted to say about this. You guys keep following along in the news and make up your decisions. One thing that's important to note is that, while the president certainly has some power in the area of immigration, particularly with regard to executive actions that Deborah's going to be talking about in a second, it should really be remembered that Congress makes the immigration laws, and the courts determine if they're fair or just. And so this really leads us to this discussion on DACA and DAPA and what has happened. Deborah will give us a little quick overview. Is she up here? Yeah, I couldn't see you. Yeah, a little overview on. Sorry, I didn't mean anything by that.
My desk, and I'm not taking off my clothes, so we're safe.
Oh goodness, because I was kind of going like, okay, yes, never mind. We all get along pretty well. But I know I'm going to be paying for this one. Yeah. So how this impacts you is that some of your workers have work authorization through DACA. DAPA hasn't come about yet, but Deborah, why don't you explain this to us?
Sure. I was actually going to make a joke that we're inclusive, but poor Bob is our one male attorney here who's very far away from our group. So I was saying we really are inclusive and diverse in our practice area. So thanks, everyone. Is this on? Can you hear me? Okay. To talk about the Supreme Court case, U.S. v. Texas. And I know you hear, oh my gosh, a lawyer's talking about court cases, but this was, I almost cried the day it came down. And that's how personal it was to me. And I would say to millions of other people living in America of what this case meant. To start of where it started from, basically, Congress has not been able to pass a comprehensive immigration reform. We have not seen any action come out of Congress. And so while we were excited when the Senate drafted an immigration bill and the House said, we're not interested in your bill. It was going nowhere. President Obama took some action saying, all right, this is what we've been working on. Here's my plan to try and solve what really is a crisis that we're seeing in our political debates of what's going on with immigration. And what had come out was a series of reforms through what he believed our laws currently allowed and he had power to do. So he came out with what we call expanded DACA and DAPA, great adjectives. DACA first came out a few years ago through executive action, which was aimed at children. So it shouldn't seem controversial. So kids who had been brought to America before age of 15, right? You don't have a lot of choice when your parents are bringing you over. You dragged your kids here. They didn't have a choice. And they went to high school or were enrolled in a GED program or graduated. They didn't have any serious criminal offenses, and they were under age 31 when the law came out. They could apply for what we call deferred action. This doesn't give them a green card. This doesn't give them other rights except they won't be deported, and they can get a work card. When they get a work card, that means they can get a Social Security number, which means they could get a driver's license, except some states were opposed to that. They could start feeling like they were part of society. So while it was a bit controversial and it wasn't the DREAM Act people had hoped for, it was a start. So President Obama created a new program to say, well, we cut off this age where you had to be under age 31. That's not really fair because some people still came as kids. They just happen to now be 32. Maybe they should still get the benefit. So they cut off the age limit and they brought up the year. So instead of entering in 2007, it was 2010. But more importantly, he also expanded it from 2 years to 3 years. Okay, not so controversial. What was bigger is that he now wanted to provide means for parents of U.S. citizen or lawful permanent resident children. This would have impacted about 4 to 5 million people in America who have children here, born here, or are permanent resident children. And this would have provided a similar path to not a green card, not citizenship, but the right to not be deported and the right to continue working. And so it would have brought people to bring themselves to the Immigration Service's attention. They'd have to have background checks run. They'd have to show they filed taxes, all of them to have the right to be here even though they're already here, and kids to feel secure that their parents wouldn't one day be deported. Well, Texas said, are you kidding me? No, so they sued. 25 states joined Texas in suing them, suing the federal government to say, President Obama, you didn't have the authority to do this. They argued they had standing, this is where we get kind of geeky in like legal terms, by saying it was harming the state because it's gonna cost them money to issue driver's license to all these people. Seriously, that's what it rests on. What happened is a Texas district court judge agreed that they had standing to sue and there could be a harm, and it created an injunction, which means the law can't go into effect. And then this went up to the Fifth Circuit. The Fifth Circuit held that, okay, we kind of agree, maybe on different grounds. Supreme Court took up the case. Rushed to hear it for the summer, Scalia dies. We have 8 members on the circuit. We have a split decision, 4-4. What's their decision? It's one line. Basically says we're remanding it back to the district court judge. The injunction stays. What does this mean? We don't know if President Obama had exceeded his authority or not. We don't know if it was an issue of standing. We don't have any clarity except we know that this is not the law. And so we're pretty much back where we started. And so why I wanted to cry is because we had hopes, you meet people for decades that one day we're going to have reform. One day you'll be able to stay here. One day there's a path. And, we had to say we have nothing for you right now. So on that exciting and great note, but this is kind of where we're at. And so the DACA for children still exists today. There are many people still working on it, going to college, starting careers and families. But it's through executive action. So whoever becomes president has the immediate right to terminate that program. And so it remains to be seen what will happen after the election of whether that will continue on.
So in our offices, we've kept a list of people that we've seen over the years, and the list keeps growing longer and longer and longer, of people who have lived here 10, 15 years, worked for maybe the same employer, and maybe the employer doesn't really know or want to know. There's paperwork that's been done, so the employer isn't really technically violating anything necessarily, but the individual is really without documents and might have children, might have spouse, might have other family members who are here lawfully, who they don't want to leave and abandon whom they're supporting. And so we keep this list, and the list just keeps getting longer and longer, and we've had this list for years now, many, many years. So we keep hoping that one day we can contact some of these people on the list so that we can do something for them. The next topic is really sort of global trends. We're involved in assisting our clients worldwide, which means that we not only help people come in from abroad to the U.S., we also help many people from the U.S. go abroad. Sometimes people forget that and think all of the, everyone's coming here, but not necessarily. There's a lot of people going to many other countries throughout the world. And, a couple of us are very involved in meeting with lawyers from around the globe who do this similar kind of work. And we've come to see some real similarities in the policies of our governments. I just was recently at an event in Italy, and I was sitting around with a bunch of immigration lawyers from around the world. And of course, what everybody wants to talk about once they find out I'm American is Trump. Is this really going to happen in the United States? Is this really the president that the United States is going to elect? And I just felt grateful that I could go back and say, you guys from UK just voted for Brexit. So at least it's not everyone looking at us. So Bob, do you have some thoughts on this?
Yeah, I've got a couple thoughts. You've got kind of two competing ideologies, and you've got this concept of globalization, which it doesn't just pertain to immigration or people. It's capital. It's this whole idea of taking whatever resources there are, human or intellectual or whatever, and getting it into the most beneficial environment. And then you have a system or an ideology which creates certain restrictive barriers or filters. And I think what we've got right now, and so it could be on a micro level, at a corporate level of restricting, or it could be at a national level based on a particular ideology, anything from ethnicities to different types of screening, which leads to distortions. And I think what we've got right now is, and it's not just here. I think it's quite broad, and in terms of the struggle between those two competing ideologies. And you can make a pretty strong case that this kind of what seems to be a certain resurgence of filters along nationalistic lines is somewhat of a reaction to such incredible movement and uncertainties in the world, kind of insecurities that we are seeing. I think be it in Brexit, be it in I think that certainly the United States and many other countries, a certain reluctance to have either open borders, at least less restrictive standards for the flow of information, people, capital, and so on. I think that, well, I guess I will speak for myself, but I think it's there's a constituency in this room. There's a feeling that there should be a greater receptivity, certainly to the flow of individuals based on merit, and whether this kind of struggle is the last throes of an age-old struggle, or if it's we're simply entering into a new chapter as people, as countries and societies try to cope with really never-ending change and very stark change, is a little bit up in the air. But I will say that in the immediate aftermath of Brexit, I think that there's a great deal of uncertainty if that was really the right decision. But anyway.
And tied to all this really also is the refugee crisis. It's a particularly hot button issue all around the world. And that's something that, a lot of the people in the UK will talk about is asylum seekers, right? Just this fear of refugees and what that's going to do to change our respective societies. Trump, as you know, has called for a ban on Muslims entering the U.S., but he's recently amended that ban somewhat to Muslims who come from countries known to breed terrorism. So I think that would be France and England. But, no, just kidding. But no, but that's true, I think. Yeah, Belgium. Clinton says we should accept refugees, including those from Syria, as we already have a strict screening process. So I want Lon to address this a little bit. She's got a strong background in refugee and asylum work. That's what she first came to Minnesota to do. And something I'm going to mention about her is that she was once a refugee herself. So what do you have to say about this?
Thanks, Laura. So when I was thinking about this topic, I was going to also share that the last time the United States received the greatest number of refugees was in the 1970s with the Southeast refugee crisis, and that's when my family came over in 1975. But ever since then, even though we've received refugees, it hasn't been to the same level as it was in the 1970s. And I think right now we are at a situation where the U.S. is looking around the world and realizing, especially under President Obama, even though it's at this late stage of the game, that we haven't taken on the responsibility of refugees, of taking in refugees from around the world. And just to give you some context here, right now there are 65 million individuals who are displaced in the world, meaning they do not have a country that they can go back home to because of war, some type of natural disaster. They're displaced. And there are 21 million refugees, I'm just rounding up or down, that the UN, the United Nations, has taken on as its responsibility and identified these individuals as refugees. We in the U.S. have taken on about 150,000 of these refugees. And I was just in Turkey this summer, where my husband's from. We go every summer. And the news that you see in Turkey, and I think around the world, is very different from what we see here. We don't see the coverage that I think other countries may see regarding the international refugee crisis that the world is facing. It's at a record high in terms of the number of refugees and displaced individuals in the world. So yesterday, or earlier this week, there was a leaders summit on refugees where President Obama pledged that the U.S. would take on 360,000 refugees in the next year, which is a substantial increase. What does that mean for us as a country? The U.S. has 4 cornerstones in terms of its immigration: family, humanitarian, and that's what the refugee crisis is about. And individuals who come to the U.S. apply for asylum if they weren't granted refugee status before they came into the U.S. And then we have family and employment. And we're going to talk a lot about employment, but we wanted to also really focus on the U.S. in the future will be seeing a lot more of these refugees and asylum seekers, but it's very difficult to get this status. And so, the cries that you hear about us opening the doors to terrorists or individuals from terrorist countries is very misleading, because they go through a very strict screening process before they're allowed to come in as a refugee in the United States. And when you do come in and apply for asylum, it's very difficult to get asylum. I think the asylum grant rate is about 50% or even 40%. And so it's a very difficult status to get. but we have been seeing it in the news in regards to Central America. And just to give you an idea of the percentage of displaced people in the world right now, only 12% come from the Americas. The rest is from the other parts of the world. And yet, what we see is about the Latinas coming across the border, and it's only 12% of the number of displaced people in the world. So it will be part of our, I think, immigration discussion in the future, depending on who is going to be elected, as to what responsibility the U.S. will be taking in regards to taking in refugees around the world. And we're on a good path right now, as I mentioned, with President Obama making this pledge, which is probably the highest number of refugees we've ever seen in the U.S. in the past 20, 30 years.
Thanks, Lon. I think it's worth just pointing out that refugees and asylees, once they've been granted asylum, are in a protected class along with lawful permanent residents and U.S. citizens in the U.S. with regard to hiring, so there cannot be discrimination against refugees or asylees who apply. Okay, we're going to move on to the next topic. So we have to just change up our panel really quickly and move along to non-immigrant visa options and H-1B alternatives, since they're so scarce, like